The fluorescent lights hum at 60 Hz, a sound most people stop hearing after 3 minutes. Rachel Torres heard it on day 1 and never stopped. St. Michael's Hospital in Norfolk smells like antiseptic and floor wax layered over something older, the mineral scent of metal and electrical current, the ghost of 1,000 patient fears absorbed into the ventilation system. She moves through the cardiac unit on her second shift like smoke, like a thing that doesn't fully occupy space, charting medications in careful handwriting, checking 4 lines with fingers that move like they're reading a language nobody else speaks. Dr. Mercer hasn't looked at her directly yet. He's looked at her resume instead, the one with the thin credentials and the 3 previous placements listed in reverse chronological order, all temporary positions, all ending without reference letters, all designed to make her look exactly as unremarkable as she needs to be. He read that paper during her hiring interview and made a decision in 6.7 seconds, the amount of time it takes to size up something that's already defeated. She watched his eyes move across the words and saw the moment his mind locked her into a category, competent enough to fill a gap, too damaged to advance, the kind of nurse who accepts assignments no one else wants and works without complaint. The cardiac unit sprawls across the 3rd floor in a figure-8 configuration, 16 beds arranged in pairs, each pair monitored by a central station that glows with the pale green of 12 simultaneously beating hearts rendered as digital lines. Rachel's hands move across those monitors the way a sniper reads windage, tracking not just the rhythm but the micro-variations in the tracings, the way a heart tired and old begins to telegraph its failure in patterns that computers flag but humans miss. She notices the colonel's monitor in room for 47 shows premature atrial contractions clustering around his sleeping hours, irregular enough to matter, subtle enough to fade into the background noise of a 180-bed hospital running at capacity. She hasn't spoken more than 12 words to Dr. Mercer yet. He rounds with the cardiac attending, Dr. Chen, a competent woman in her 50s who nods at Rachel when passing, and Mercer in his crisp white coat, the fabric so pristine it might be replaced daily, moving like a man who's never once felt uncertain in his own skin. His hands are soft. Rachel noticed this during her first shift, watching him examine a patient, the hands of someone who hasn't held anything that struggled against being held. The wedding ring catches the fluorescent light when he writes notes. Cartier, she notes, the kind that costs what she was paid annually in her previous life. The kind that announces itself without needing to speak. Mercer paused outside room for 07 during rounds yesterday morning, turned to the assembled residents and nurses, and said something about the temp assignments this month, a comment that wasn't quite directed at anyone but somehow landed on Rachel like a designation, like a stamp pressed onto paper. The agency's really scraping the barrel, he'd said to Chen while signing an order, his voice carrying just far enough to be overheard. 3 prior positions. I wonder what it says about a nurse's competence when 3 different units decided they didn't need her. Chen made a noncommittal sound. Rachel was 2 rooms away, ostensibly adjusting an 4-pump, her jaw clenched tight as a fist but her hand steady as surgical steel. That same afternoon, the whispers started moving through the unit like ripples. Rachel heard them in fragments, conversations that stopped when she approached, voices that resumed the moment she passed. Nurse Martinez, who worked the night shift, mentioned she'd heard from a supervisor at Rachel's previous posting that Rachel had made mistakes with medication dosing, that she'd missed something critical on a 12-lead EKG, that she'd been let go quietly to avoid the paperwork. Nobody verified it. Nobody needed to. The story moved through St. Michael's like a virus, each person who heard it adding a detail, embellishing the failure into something more substantial, until Rachel Torres was no longer just unproven, she was actively dangerous, a liability walking around in scrubs. The break room cleared when she sat down yesterday at 2:17 p.m. She knew the exact time because she'd looked at the clock, cataloging the precision of the rejection, not a gradual drift but a coordinated evacuation. 2 nurses stood up simultaneously, remembered tasks elsewhere, their eyes sliding away from hers like water off oil. One had waved at her that morning. Now she didn't make eye contact. Rachel ate her sandwich alone and timed how long it took before the room refilled behind her, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Long enough to be intentional. Long enough to sting if she let it. She didn't let it. The colonel is in room for 47, bed A, the one closer to the window. His name is Colonel James Hartley, retired Air Force, 73 years old, admitted 4 days ago with a thoracic aortic aneurysm that's being managed medically for now, a 4.2 centimeter bulge in the arterial wall, contained but not stable, the kind of condition that could resolve with careful monitoring or accelerate into catastrophe without warning. He has dementia, advanced enough that he mostly exists in scattered moments, his consciousness moving through time like a radio tuning in and out of stations. His daughter visits every afternoon at 3. His son called once from San Diego and hasn't called back. Rachel enters room for 47 at 6:23 a.m., her shift beginning in the pre-dawn darkness when the hospital exhales and the monitors sound louder, their beeps echoing down corridors that won't fill with voices for another hour. She moves toward the colonel's bed with the same economical precision she brings to everything, minimal motion, efficient approach, the kind of movement that takes up the smallest possible space. His eyes open as she reaches for his wrist, trying to collect a pulse before the monitors catch it. She's been doing this every morning for 7 days, and every morning his eyes search her face like he's looking for a name that's just out of reach. Torres, he whispers, his voice like gravel in a tin can. She glances down at his right forearm, at the faded tattoo in green ink, the letters barely distinguishable now from the liver spots that have bloomed across his skin over the past 18 months. Hawk, he says, squeezing his eyes shut. The girl from Ramadi. She carried me 3 miles. Under fire. His hand grips her wrist with surprising strength. We were at Jolan District when the first rounds came down. She was fire support. She came back for me. His eyes open again, searching her face. But I can't see her anymore. Rachel's pulse sits at the base of her jaw, thrumming against the inside of her skin. She checks the monitors anyway, documenting the colonel's vitals in careful handwriting, heart rate 68, blood pressure 147/82, oxygen saturation 96 on room air, the readings of a man whose body is still running even as his mind fragmentizes into disconnected images. The colonel's fingers release her wrist. He settles back against the pillow. Within seconds, he's asleep again, his face collapsing into the slack expression of someone who's given up trying to hold the pieces together. She doesn't limp when she exits room for 47. The left leg injury only shows when she's tired, when the day has accumulated its weight on her spine and her body forgets to compensate. She's only been here 7 days. She has at least 6 months of operational parameters to maintain, surveillance protocols to follow, the colonel's medical file to continue monitoring for any changes that might indicate outside interference. The extraction protocols are clear. If her cover is blown before the mole is identified and neutralized, she has 72 hours to relocate. Her daughter is staying with her mother in Charlottesville. Her apartment lease is month to month. Her car is registered under the temporary identity, easily abandoned if necessary. The nurse's station is still quiet at 6:34 a.m., just the night shift finishing charting and preparing the handoff. Rachel passes Martinez, who doesn't look up from her computer screen. She passes Jennifer, who glances sideways and suddenly finds something fascinating about the ceiling tiles. This is the status quo now. She's not being harassed openly yet, just systematically isolated, which is stage 1, which is fine. She's been in worse positions. She's been in worse positions with bullets moving past her head. Mercer arrives at 7:19 a.m., taking the stairs instead of the elevator, his footsteps hitting the concrete landing with the confident impact of someone who's never once felt like an outsider in his own space. Rachel is charting at the station, her hands moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. She doesn't look up when he enters, doesn't acknowledge his presence, maintains the invisible boundary that's already forming between herself and the rest of the unit. He stops directly in her line of sight anyway. "Ms. Torres," he says, his voice carrying the tone someone uses when addressing household staff. "I need you to review the EKG protocols for this unit." He sets a printed sheet in front of her, not handing it to her but placing it like an object for her to fetch. "The standards here might be different from wherever you came from." Rachel glances at the document, a standard 12-lead interpretation checklist, then back at Mercer. Her response comes out soft, just barely above a whisper, the voice of someone who's accepted their diminished position. "I'll study it today." He nods, satisfied with her compliance, and moves into the unit proper, already scanning the morning's patient list. Rachel looks back at her charting. Around the station, she feels the weight of the observation, people who heard that interaction, who are silently confirming that yes, she's exactly what Mercer indicated, she's the kind of nurse who gets corrected publicly, who accepts instruction like a student, who belongs in the category of disposable. What they don't know is that she's been running counterintelligence operations for the Department of Defense for the past 11 years. What they don't know is that the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, 2nd Squadron, Air Force Special Operations, was earned in a country they couldn't find on a map, in a situation they couldn't imagine, under a call sign that would mean nothing to them but everything to a man with a tattoo on his right forearm and memories that are slowly, mercifully, slipping away. What they don't know is that the colonel in room 447 gave that command when she was 26 years old and wearing a uniform instead of scrubs, and that she would walk into fire again if he asked, identity exposure and extraction protocols be damned. But that wasn't something Dr. Mercer would ever discover, not unless something forced it into daylight. Not unless something went badly wrong. The morning light through the hospital windows hit Rachel's face as she approached the colonel's room with his medication chart. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway, his voice already carrying that particular edge, the one he reserved for her. "Miss Torres, could you explain to me, and to this family, why you documented a potassium level that contradicts the lab report by 3 full points?" The colonel's son looked up from his chair. Rachel opened her mouth. "Or is reading basic blood work beyond the skill set they taught you at whatever strip mall nursing program you attended?" Mercer didn't wait for an answer. His words were arrows, deliberately fired where they'd ricochet. The son's concern deepened. A nurse passing in the hallway slowed, listening. Rachel's jaw tightened. One muscle. That was all. Her voice came out level, steady as a surgical laser. "That chart was signed by. I've seen your file." Mercer stepped closer, his presence making the air pressure change, filling the small space like a predator marking territory. 3 placements in 18 months. Do you know what we call that? A liability. He turned to the son with a thin smile. "Don't worry, we have real nurses on this unit." Rachel held his gaze. Flat. Arctic. Not angry, colder than anger. Her spine straightened, rigid as a rifle barrel. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked, her footsteps echoing down the corridor with military precision. Behind her, Mercer's face flushed crimson, his power play deflected by her refusal to break. He'd expected tears or trembling. Instead, he got ice. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, Rachel sat alone in the break room with her sandwich. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm above her head. She'd been there for 45 seconds when Nurse Peterson suddenly remembered she needed to check on a patient in 4C. Then Kim's phone rang, the one that hadn't buzzed, hadn't vibrated, just rang into existence in her hand. The new resident looked at Rachel, then followed the others out without a word, leaving his coffee steaming on the table like abandoned evidence. Rachel ate her sandwich. Her eyes tracked the doorway like she was clearing corners, like muscle memory was running operations beneath her skin. The break room door swung shut. She was alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sound of her own breathing. By the end of that week, the public disciplinary board in the staff corridor had grown. A new entry, written in Mercer's handwriting, R. Torres, failure to follow medication protocols, written warning 1 of 3. Staff read it as they passed. Their eyes slid away when Rachel approached, like she was infected, like proximity to her failure might be contagious. She'd never touched that chart. Mercer knew it. That was the point. During a code response meeting on Friday, Rachel raised her hand about crash cart positioning during pediatric resuscitations. The new protocol had changed cart placement, moving it further from the trauma bays. It would cost seconds during an emergency. Seconds killed. "I'd recommend reverting to the old position at the unit entrance," she said quietly. "Reduces approach time by." "I appreciate input from qualified personnel," Mercer interrupted, his voice carrying across the conference table like a whip crack. "Temps can observe." Laughter rippled through the room. The sound was like a shark sensing blood. Rachel waited until it stopped. The other nurses looked down at their coffee cups and notepads, nobody meeting her eyes. She stood slowly. When she spoke, her voice came out like a blade sliding from a sheath. "The only thing more fragile than your ego is your understanding of cardiology." The room went dead silent. She walked out, her footsteps echoing in the sudden absence of sound. The laughter died. The side conversation stopped. Even the fluorescent light seemed to dim. Mercer's face wasn't just red anymore, it was the color of someone whose control just cracked, whose authority had just been questioned in front of the people he was supposed to command. Rachel didn't look back. At 6 in the morning, before Emily woke up, Rachel's handler texted, "Target stable. Maintain position. Mole still unidentified." The mission was unchanged, even as everything around it was collapsing. Somewhere inside St. Michael's, someone was feeding information to people who wanted the colonel dead. Rachel was supposed to find them without being discovered. Now Mercer was actively trying to burn her cover, and if he succeeded, extraction meant failure. It meant Emily losing her mother's presence, meant the colonel losing his protection, meant cartel contractors finding him in whatever new facility they placed him in. Rachel kissed Emily's forehead at breakfast. "Why don't the other nurses like Mommy?" her daughter asked, her voice small and confused. Rachel couldn't answer that. She braided Emily's hair instead and drove to St. Michael's with her hand steady on the wheel. Mercer distributed new protocol binders during the morning staff meeting. His voice had an edge of triumph in it. "We need to ensure our standards haven't slipped. All temporary staff will be subject to weekly competency reviews, effective immediately. Professional development, really. For everyone's benefit." He looked directly at Rachel when he said it. She took the binder without expression, watching him work the room. Mercer was intelligent, that was the danger. He wasn't just bullying her. He was building a case. During lunch, she learned why. Her handler texted, "HR received calls from your references. Mercer's verifying your credentials." They held, but barely. He's looking for cracks. The pre-recorded responses from her fabricated references, maintained by an intelligence unit buried 3 levels deep in the Pentagon, were professional but thin. Designed to hold up to basic verification. Not to determine scrutiny. Rachel watched through the break room window as Mercer made another call, his body language predatory, confident. He was testing the ice. Looking for where it would break. That afternoon, the colonel's son visited. He mentioned casually, like it didn't matter, that his father seemed more agitated. "He's been talking about Iraq a lot. About someone named Hawk. I don't know who that is. The dementia, I guess. Memory gets all jumbled." Rachel's pulse quickened. She kept her face neutral. Dementia patients often fixate on the past. It's common. The emotional weight of military service stays with them, even when other memories fade. The son nodded, unsatisfied. He didn't know who Hawk was. That was good. Rachel's call sign was supposed to be buried, classified, forgotten. The colonel shouldn't remember. The dementia was supposed to protect that secret. That night, her handler called. The voice was clinical, professional, and underneath it, worried. "Mercer's digging. If he breaks your cover, we extract you and the colonel. Mission ends. Mole goes free. Is that understood?" Rachel looked through the doorway at Emily sleeping, her daughter's hair still in the braid from that morning. Understood. The next morning, the colonel coded. The alarm screamed from room for 47 at 08 for 7. Rachel was 2 floors below, restocking the supply cabinet in the basement corridor when the overhead crackled, code blue, cardiac, room for 47. Her hands froze on a box of 14-gauge angiocath needles. Room for 47. The colonel's room. The monitors on the unit had been steady all morning. She'd checked them at 0630 during her rounds, watched his oxygen saturation hold at 96%, his heart rate steady at 72. Routine. Normal. The kind of morning that didn't announce itself with emergency klaxons. She was moving before the intercom finished its alert. The stairwell was empty. Her boots echoed on the concrete steps, 2 at a time, her thigh muscles remembering 1,000 runs through desert camps where speed meant the difference between a casualty and a recovery. 4th floor. The cardiac unit doors burst open ahead of her, and she moved through them like water finding a crack, her hospital ID already in hand, just a temp nurse responding to a code, nothing more, nothing less. Room for 47 stood open, its door swung wide, and Rachel could see him before she cleared the threshold, the colonel in his bed, his chest heaving against the oxygen mask, his monitors painting a landscape of catastrophe across the screens. Ventricular fibrillation. VFib. The rhythm of a heart that had given up trying and settled instead into chaotic electrical noise, useless and dying. The crash cart sat beside the bed, its defibrillator pads still in their plastic sleeves. Dr. Mercer was frozen. He stood beside the crash cart with his hands hovering uselessly over the controls, his surgeon's fingers trembling in the air like he was conducting an orchestra that didn't exist. His face had gone the color of spoiled cream. "He's in VFib," Mercer stammered, his voice cracking across every syllable. "I was just checking his incision when he coded. I was right here. I didn't." His eyes met Rachel's and she saw the thing she'd seen in men before, the recognition that he was standing next to someone for whom this moment was not a crisis but a job. Rachel didn't wait. She moved forward with the kind of fluid precision that came from 17 years of responding to the things that couldn't be rehearsed, couldn't be planned for, could only be endured. She grabbed Mercer by the upper arm and shoved him sideways hard enough that he stumbled into the wall, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The attending physician hadn't yet reached the room. The code team was 90 seconds out at minimum. She could hear them crashing up the stairs, their footsteps still 3 floors away. 90 seconds was an eternity when a heart was in fibrillation. 90 seconds was the difference between a recovery and a funeral. The scalpel was on the procedure tray beside the bed, meant for removing old surgical tape. Rachel picked it up and made a single decisive cut between the colonel's ribs, left side, in the space between the 4th and 5th intercostal space where she'd been trained to cut when the world was burning and waiting wasn't an option. The gown parted. The skin beneath it opened like a door. Blood welled up dark and immediate, copper-scented, warm against her hands. Her hand disappeared into his chest cavity. She found his heart with the sureness of someone who had searched for it in worse places, in darker places, in the bodies of men whose names she carried like scars. The muscle was fluttering uselessly, attempting rhythm and finding none. She cradled it in her palm the way she might have cradled something precious and fragile, and then she began to squeeze, compression, release, in the rhythm that 17 years of muscle memory had burned into her bones. The heart was warm. Slick. It resisted her at first, and then she felt it stutter beneath her hand like a light switch flickering, a moment of connection, a moment of. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. A rhythm. Not perfect. Not yet normal. But rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The heart had caught fire again beneath her hands, had remembered how to beat, had chosen life over the seductive mathematics of fibrillation. The code team crashed through the door 30 seconds later to find the colonel alive, his monitors climbing toward stability, Rachel's hand still inside his chest, blood rising past her elbows in a tide that looked like violence and was actually mercy. The attending physician who entered first, a woman named Dr. Chen with steel-gray hair and the kind of command presence that came from 15 years of watching people die, stopped moving entirely. Her eyes went to the colonel. To the monitors showing climbing oxygen saturation. To Rachel's hand performing compressions inside an open chest cavity. "What the hell did you just do?" Dr. Chen whispered. Rachel withdrew her hand slowly, carefully, watching the heart continue its newfound rhythm without her touch. Someone offered her a towel. She accepted it, wiped the blood from her skin with the same calm a mechanic might use wiping grease from a tool, and when she looked up, her voice came out steady as a metronome, field thoracotomy. He couldn't wait for the pads. The attending's eyes went wide, not with gratitude, but with something else. Recognition. Understanding. The kind of knowing that came when you realized the person standing in front of you had done something that civilians didn't know how to do, that most physicians spent their entire careers reading about in textbooks but never actually performed outside of a simulation lab. Dr. Chen opened her mouth. Closed it. She gestured toward the monitors. Get him prepped for the OR. We need to close that cavity surgically before infection becomes a factor. Now. The code team moved like a coordinated machine, muscle memory and training taking over, and Rachel stepped backward into the corner of the room, already fading back into the landscape of casual staff and temporary assignments. But Mercer was already moving. His face had transformed in the span of 30 seconds, shock reshaping itself into something colder and more calculated. His hands had stopped trembling. His eyes had stopped wavering. He'd watched Rachel pull a dying man back from the edge of a precipice using nothing but a scalpel and 17 years of training she was never supposed to possess, and his surgeon's mind had been quick enough to understand exactly what that meant. Liability. Danger. Exposure. He pulled his phone from his pocket with the movements of a man executing a predetermined plan. Tom? It's David Mercer. I need you to call an emergency board meeting. Right now, not later, not this afternoon, right now. He was already moving toward the corridor, his voice dropping into the careful register of someone making a call that needed to be preserved, documented, remembered. We have a major liability situation. A nurse with no credentials just performed emergency surgery on a patient in my unit without a physician's direct oversight. That's grounds for immediate suspension, criminal investigation, and probably malpractice exposure for the entire hospital. I'm documenting everything. I want her escorted from the premises before end of shift. Rachel stood in the corner with blood drying on her skin and said nothing at all. Her hands had stopped shaking the moment the colonel's heart started beating again. That was the problem, she understood now, watching Mercer disappear into the hallway with his phone pressed against his ear like a weapon. Her hands didn't shake during crisis. Her voice didn't crack during emergencies. She didn't have the luxury of trauma response because trauma was just data, and data was actionable information, and information was survival. She was trained to endure the things that broke civilians into pieces, and Mercer had just watched her do it with his own eyes, and now he understood that she was something dangerous in his hospital. Something that needed to be removed. The colonel's oxygen saturation climbed to 98% on the monitors. His heart maintained rhythm. The code team wheeled him toward the operating room with the kind of careful precision that suggested they knew exactly how close they'd come to his death, how improbable it was that he was still breathing at all. Dr. Chen paused at the doorway and looked back at Rachel with an expression that contained 1,000 questions, but she didn't ask them. Not yet. Not here. Rachel nodded slightly, the kind of acknowledgement that said, I'll explain when we're not in front of everyone. But that moment was already gone. Dr. Mercer moved through the hospital with the precision of a man who'd already calculated every move. 2 hours. That's how long Rachel had been escorted out of St. Michael's by security, her cardboard box of personal belongings clutched against her chest like evidence at a crime scene. He stood in his office on the 4th floor, door closed, and pulled out his phone. The Wednesday afternoon sun slanted through the Venetian blinds, casting shadow stripes across his desk like prison bars he had no intention of occupying. First call, Mitchell Bancroft, Hospital Board President. Mercer knew his schedule. Golf at Thalassa Country Club every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. The kind of man who answered his phone mid-swing because refusing to take a call from the cardiac unit director might mean missing a potential lawsuit. The phone rang twice before Bancroft answered, slightly breathless. Dr. Mercer. Everything all right? No. Mercer's voice carried the weight of a man bearing bad news, a man of integrity forced to expose something ugly. We have a serious problem. The temp nurse who just performed that emergency procedure this morning, Rachel Torres. Her credentials don't check out. Silence. Good silence. The kind that meant Bancroft was already calculating hospital liability. What do you mean, don't check out? I mean she has no verifiable references. I contacted her previous employers, all 3 placements listed on her application. Not one of them has any record of her working there. No employment dates. No performance reviews. Nothing. Mercer paused, letting the weight settle. She performed an invasive emergency procedure without proper authorization. Physical assault on a physician. And now I'm discovering she may not even have legitimate nursing credentials. Bancroft's exhale came through the phone like a deflating tire. Where is she now? I had her escorted out pending investigation. But we need to move fast. If this gets out, if the state board finds out we employed someone with potentially fraudulent credentials, we're looking at fines, loss of accreditation, lawsuits from every family that's had her touch a patient in 6 months. I'm calling the state medical board right now, Bancroft said. And our HR director. Keep documentation of everything she's done since she arrived. Every patient interaction. Every incident. Mercer smiled. He'd already started a file. Already on it. The second call went to the state investigator assigned to credential fraud cases, a woman named Detective Chen who'd been expecting his call since Mercer had started planting seeds 3 days ago with anonymous tips about inconsistencies in temp placement. He presented himself as a concerned physician, a man who'd done his due diligence and uncovered something that didn't smell right. She fabricated employment history, he told Chen. I have documentation. 3 previous facilities, and when I called directly, none of them had records. One facility said they've never had a Rachel Torres work there at all. We'll open an investigation, Chen said. Her voice was bureaucratic, efficient, already processing the paperwork in her mind. Can you provide contact information for the previous employers? Already compiled, Mercer said. He'd created those references himself, coached them through burner phone calls, ensured they would confirm the false narrative if contacted. They wouldn't help Rachel. They couldn't. Each one had been instructed to claim they'd never heard of her, or to confirm minimal employment with spotty performance. Deniability all the way down. Third call, HR Director Patterson, who Mercer had already visited in person with a stack of incident reports. Each one meticulously documented, some real, some fabricated, painting a picture of a nurse who was erratic, unreliable, and potentially dangerous. The state is opening a formal investigation, Patterson said. I've already prepared a suspension notice. We'll need you to provide a detailed statement about today's incident, the unauthorized procedure, the physical assault on you. I'll have it typed up within the hour, Mercer said. But Patterson, we can't take any chances. She needs to be escorted from the building today. All access revoked. Badge deactivated. Already done. Mercer hung up and leaned back in his chair. The dominoes were falling exactly as they should. Rachel Torres, whoever she really was, had made a critical error when she'd shoved him aside at the crash cart. She'd revealed competence. Revealed knowledge. Revealed something that didn't match the frightened temp nurse profile she'd maintained for 6 months. But that competence was a weapon that had now turned inward. Because a nurse didn't perform emergency thoracotomies with steady hands and flawless procedure unless she'd done it before. Unless she'd been trained. And when an investigator started pulling on that thread, they wouldn't find a nurse. They'd find something else entirely. Mercer had no way of knowing what. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: Rachel Torres would be gone from St. Michael's by end of business, and with her would go any threat to his position, his reputation, his careful construction of a career built on other people's mistakes. He stood and walked to the window. 14 floors below, security was escorting Rachel through the main lobby. He could see the top of her head, the cardboard box, the way her spine remained perfectly vertical even as she walked out of her job. He watched until she disappeared through the automatic doors. Then he picked up his office phone and called security. Deactivate badge 4472. Full access lock. And make sure she's documented as terminated for cause in the system. Done, the security director confirmed. Anything else? No, Mercer said. That's everything. But it wasn't everything. The phone on his desk buzzed at 1,410 hours. A text from his contact at the hospital foundation: state investigators are in the building. They want to access personnel files and patient charts. They're requesting all documentation related to Rachel Torres's employment and any incidents involving her patient interactions. Mercer's stomach didn't drop. Not yet. The investigators were fishing. That's all this was. He had nothing to fear. The fabricated references would hold. The incident reports were solid. Rachel's background would collapse under scrutiny, and when it did, he would be the hero who'd uncovered the fraud. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that while he'd been making calls and constructing his narrative, Rachel had been doing something else entirely. Her handler had texted at 14:05, Mercer is escalating. We're moving timeline. Prepare for extraction protocols. Do not acknowledge. Do not respond. Check your 6. Rachel sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for exactly 4 minutes after security released her. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel. She'd trained for exposure. She'd trained for blown covers and emergency extractions. What she hadn't trained for was the feeling of her 8-year-old daughter asking why mommy wasn't at work. She drove home in silence. Emily came through the front door at 11:45 the next morning, early dismissal for teacher conferences that Rachel was no longer authorized to attend. She found her mother at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The apartment was small, a rental, temporary, forgettable. All her safe houses looked like this. Functional. Soulless. A place you didn't unpack because you were always leaving. Mommy. Emily's backpack slid off one shoulder. Why aren't you at work? Rachel pulled her daughter close and didn't answer. She couldn't. The extraction timeline was 1,800 hours. In 6.5 hours, she would pack 3 bags, tell Emily they were going on an adventure, and disappear. The Colonel would be extracted separately. Her handler would sanitize the apartment. Another identity would dissolve. She held Emily and felt the weight of 18 months of operational cover crashing down like a ceiling collapsing. 18 months of being invisible. 18 months of watching the Colonel fade into dementia while she kept him breathing. 18 months of absorbing Mercer's contempt because absorbing it was the mission. And now it was over. The phone on the table buzzed at 1,347 hours. An unknown number. Rachel almost didn't look at it. The text read, Colonel's son requesting meeting at hospital tomorrow 1400. Your presence required. Come in civilian clothes. This is not a request. Rachel stared at the message. Civilian clothes meant exposure. Hospital meant witnesses. Required meant command authority she didn't recognize. She texted back, confirm sender. The response came in 12 seconds, JSOC command. Colonel Hendricks has been briefed. He remembers you now. The medication cleared. He's asking for Captain Torres by name. Come armed. Come ready. This ends tomorrow. Rachel set the phone down and looked at Emily, her daughter still small enough to sit in her lap, still young enough to believe her mother could fix anything. We're going on an adventure, Rachel said. But first, we have one more stop at the hospital. Emily nodded, the way children do when they trust absolutely. Rachel drove through the city at exactly the speed limit, the faded unit patch pressed against her ribs beneath her jacket lining like a heartbeat she'd thought was dead. The extraction was cancelled. The mission had just become something else entirely. Mercer had no idea what was coming. The conference room door closed with a soft hiss of hydraulics, isolating Dr. Mercer from the hallway where 75 combat veterans stood motionless as a wall of slate-gray silence. They didn't move. They didn't shift their weight or cross their arms. MSG Ramirez, who'd served with Colonel Hendricks in 2000 for Ramadi, stood at the front, his presence like a loaded gun holstered but visible. The colonel's son stood beside him, one hand on his father's wheelchair. Inside the conference room, Agent Chen didn't wait for pleasantries. She opened a laptop, turned the screen toward Mercer, and let the data speak first. Her hands moved with the precise efficiency of someone who'd been building cases against corrupt doctors for 12 years. Your audit of Rachel Torres' credentials triggered our audit of your patient files, she said. The screen filled with highlighted charts. Red boxes. Blue boxes. Timestamps. Dosage discrepancies. We found 17 instances where you altered patient records post-incident. Mercer's jaw tightened. That's medication errors blamed on nursing staff, Agent Chen continued, not pausing. Lab results modified to hide delayed diagnoses. You used the disciplinary system to bury your mistakes. Classic pattern. You create a scapegoat, file complaints against them, and when their credibility is destroyed, nobody questions your numbers anymore. She clicked through another chart. Except Captain Torres didn't stay destroyed. The use of the rank hung in the air like a defibrillator paddle after a shock. Mercer's hand started to shake. Not from fear, or not yet. From the realization that he'd been playing chess with someone whose entire career was chess. I'm the cardiac unit director. I have credentials. I have a reputation. I have? You have $40,000 deposited into an offshore account, Agent Park interrupted, sliding a folder across the table. This one was older, more weathered. The kind of folder that had traveled through federal buildings. Paid by cartel contractors looking for Colonel Hendricks' location and medical schedule. You accessed his protected patient file from your home IP address at 0300 last Tuesday. That information was uploaded to an encrypted server. You weren't investigating Rachel Torres. You were the mole. Mercer stood. His chair scraped backward with the sound of a coffin being sealed. Sit down, Chen said. It wasn't a request. 2 federal marshals materialized at the conference room door like they'd been condensed from the walls themselves. Mercer Saturday. His face had gone the color of old bone, the kind of white that comes when the blood realizes where it's headed. Park continued. Rachel Torres was getting too close to identifying you. Every time she accessed the colonel's file for legitimate medical reasons, she got closer to seeing the pattern. So you tried to destroy her credibility first. Make her radioactive. Get her fired. Get her arrested. Get her off the case before she could connect the dots. Park leaned back in his chair. You gambled that suspending a temp nurse would be easier than explaining federal security breaches. You were wrong. Mercer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You have the right to remain silent, Chen said, pulling out a card and placing it on the table. The Miranda card sat there like a menu of bad choices. But I'd suggest you don't exercise that option. Your cooperation regarding the other members of the network is the only thing standing between a 15-year sentence and a 25-year one. Back in the main conference room, Rachel knelt beside the colonel's wheelchair, her dress uniform catching the fluorescent light like a medal itself. He took her hand with trembling fingers, not the trembling of age, but the trembling of a man holding proof that what he thought was lost had been found. His right sleeve was already rolled up. The tattoo sat on his forearm like a memorial, R. Torres. 2 initials. 19 years of memory. I got this in Germany, the colonel said, his voice rough enough to carry the weight of all those years. While they were putting me back together. I told the tattoo artist I'd never forget the girl who carried me out of hell. 3 miles. Through Ramadi. Under fire. His eyes locked on hers. The clarity in them was new, the dementia gone, burned away by the shock of recognition, by seeing her hands move during the code with the same precision they'd moved in a desert city 2 decades ago. Then the dementia took it all. Stole every memory of you. But when I heard your voice, when you reached into my chest and brought me back. His son placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. He's been talking about you for 19 years. Every lucid moment, every visit. He described you like you were there. Like you were still coming back. The son's voice cracked. When we heard you worked here, that you were the one who saved him at St. Michael's, we needed to bring everyone. Everyone who served with him. To thank you. To stand with you. Rachel looked up at the 75 veterans filing into the conference room now that Mercer had been isolated. They moved like a unit even at rest, they're bearing a language spoken by people who'd learned to communicate through presence alone. Master Sergeant Ramirez stepped forward in full dress uniform, his ribbons a catalogue of deserts and valleys and villages where decisions had been made in seconds. His right hand came up in a salute so precise it sounded like a rifle chamber closing. "We take care of our own, Captain," Ramirez said. The words landed like orders. The other 74 veterans saluted in sequence, not together, but in a rolling wave like a flag catching wind. Rachel stood. Her right hand came up to her brow, the muscle memory so old it predated her career at St. Michael's by 12 years. The salute held. The room held. Time held. Then the door opened again and security walked Dr. Mercer out in handcuffs. The veterans parted silently to let him pass, creating a corridor of absolute stillness. He didn't look up. He couldn't. The weight of their silence was heavier than words, heavier than accusations, heavier than all the fabricated complaints and destroyed credentials he'd weaponized. Silence from 75 people who'd learned that words were sometimes the weakest thing a human being could offer. The echo of his handcuffs, metal on metal, an acoustic signature of failure, faded down the corridor. Rachel stood in the center of the veterans with her hand still raised, and nobody moved until the colonel's voice broke the quiet. "Welcome home, Hawk." 6 months later, Rachel sat at a table draped in white linen at a Veterans Affairs benefit dinner in Norfolk, her daughter Emily asleep against her shoulder in a dress that still had the creases from the shopping bag. The dress uniform hung on Rachel's frame like a second skin, one she'd worn for the first time publicly since her identity had been revealed. Medals lined her chest in ascending order, Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross at the end like a period at the end of a sentence about sacrifices nobody asked her to make. A Pentagon liaison approached with a leather folder and the kind of smile that came from delivering good news about bad people. Dr. Mercer pled guilty to 23 counts, she said, opening the folder. Fraud, obstruction, conspiracy to commit espionage. 8 years federal. His medical license is permanently revoked. The liaison almost smiled. Last we heard, his teaching CPR certification at Norfolk Community College. Adjunct Instructor position. Minimum wage. Rachel nodded. Felt nothing. The vindication was there but distant, like looking at someone else's photograph. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, the liaison said, and Rachel recognized the quote from somewhere, a conversation she'd had with a federal agent, or maybe something the colonel had whispered when he first remembered her name. The liaison continued, "That was you. In that hospital. With nobody knowing who you actually were." Colonel Hendricks appeared before Rachel could respond, his hand steady on her shoulder. The experimental treatment the VA had fast-tracked after her identity became public had restored his memory, not completely, but enough. Enough to recognize her. Enough to remember. His grip was light but firm, the way a man holds something he'd thought was lost forever. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, guiding her toward a cluster of young combat medics in dress uniform, all of them impossibly young, all of them wearing the focus of people learning something that might save their lives someday. "They're starting a training program based on your remedy after-action reports. Field thoracotomy protocols. How to stay calm when there's nothing between you and the patient but your hands." Rachel shook each hand. Saw herself 19 years ago reflected in their nervous faces, the ones who'd answered calls in the dark and did what needed doing without waiting for permission. Emily stirred against her shoulder, half waking, and tugged at Rachel's sleeve with the kind of directness only 8-year-olds possessed. "Mommy, why is everyone calling you Captain?" "You're a nurse," Emily said, the logic of childhood cutting through the weight of medals and secrets and double lives. Rachel knelt down to her daughter's level, her dress uniform creating a sound like whispered orders. She took Emily's hands in hers, hands that had held lives together, hands that had pressed against a heart in Ramadi and in Norfolk, hands that had learned to be steady in places where steadiness was the only thing between breathing and not. "I'm both, baby," Rachel said. "I've always been both." The Colonel placed a hand on Emily's shoulder with the gentleness of a man who'd learned how fragile memory actually was. "Your mom saved my life twice. Once in Iraq when she carried me out of hell. And once at St. Michael's when she reached into my chest and brought me back from flatline." His voice held the weight of 19 years of debt paid forward. "That makes her family." The young medics crowded around with questions about technique, about oxygen saturation during field thoracotomy, about making impossible choices in impossible time. Rachel answered each one with the same flat precision she'd used to deliver her sentences to Dr. Mercer, but now the ice was gone. Just the truth, clean and sharp as the scalpel she'd used on the Colonel's chest. As the dinner ended and waiters cleared plates, Rachel received a forwarded email on her phone. A community college course catalog. She clicked the link and there he was, Dr. Mercer's photo beside a CPR certification class listing. The title read Adjunct Instructor. The expression in his eyes was hollow in a way that 8 years in federal prison hadn't even created yet. Rachel deleted the email without comment and put her phone away. Emily fell asleep against her shoulder during the drive home, and Rachel carried her inside the small apartment on the edge of Norfolk, thinking of the 3 miles she'd carried the Colonel through Ramadi under fire, thinking of the weight we carry for those who can't carry themselves, thinking of how some debts take 19 years to settle and some settle in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Her secure phone buzzed at 2,300 hours. Rachel set Emily down on her bed, covered her with a blanket, and opened the message from JSOC Command. Another mission. Another identity. Another hospital, another city, another cover to slip into like a coat that had been tailored specifically for her shoulders. Rachel read the parameters, committed them to memory, and began planning. Hawk was always ready to fly. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.